How's it going, Rebecca?
Hey Joe, going super well, enjoying Munich in summer this side.
What's Munich in summer like?
Well, it's actually warmer than I thought. So, we've only
Yeah.
just entered summer and, it's chilling around 25 degrees, some days hitting 29, and it's like wind still, which is amazing. So, people have flocked to the lakes and stuff. Totally more vibey than winter.
I think I must have hit it like right at the kind of the end of spring or something. I'm not sure what happened, but
Yeah,
anyways.
we're still deep in spring, actually, to be honest. I think it's really heated up quite a lot since you were here.
Okay. Well, it's my gift to you. So just kidding. So awesome. Well, on the show today we have Rebecca Taylor. For people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Basically, I come from South Africa. First interesting, fact about me. I studied electronic engineering with computer science, and that was, I don't know, about 11, 12 years ago. I did my master's in a similar vein, PhD in Bayesian statistics,
Hmm.
kind of got into data science that way, and then worked in a large corporate for 5 years. Did a lot of very various things, including lots of data analytics and trying to do machine learning where possible, but it was quite an old school company, and then pivoted into consulting for about 5 years. In the data space, went in thinking I do data science and did everything but data science. Um, and
Oh,
then, yeah, I can talk about that later. But yeah, and then at the moment, I've joined a really big company again, so gone back the full corporate cycle, Little Digital, which is part of the Schwartz Group. So, I'm sure maybe some of you guys know about Lidl. There's also some in USA. Um, it's basically a retailer, right?
yeah.
Um, yeah, and I'm the lead ML ops engineer there, and also, yeah, splitting my time up a bit, which is quite tricky. So I'm heading up the personalization side of things well, not heading it up, but I'm the tech lead for that, and that's like anything to do with personalization. Yeah,
Wow, it's quite a bit.
quite busy.
Yeah, when we were hanging out actually in Munich, I think I asked you about Bayesian
Hmm.
stats. I don't meet a lot of Bayesians, and so when I do, I'm always curious, like what drove you towards the Bayesian route versus the frequentist route? 'Cause I know that's like the sort of the East Coast West Coast battle. If I were to use American comparisons, so
Yeah, for sure. I think when I started that journey, the Bayesians weren't necessarily like losing, and at the moment they probably are. So, given all these new generative models, I think the frequentists have kind of taken front and center at the moment. So, back then, it was like kind of the beginning of when I got interested. That was even before I did my PhD. So it was in my undergrad. I met a prof. He taught us our signal processing course, which went into like a data science machine
mm,
learning course. So it was like really kind of the fundamentals of data science, kind of like the PCA, LDA, all of those type of things, kernel methods, really mathematical kind of take on it. And then he also taught us the probability theory side and like everything to do with like uncertainty and how you can, like model uncertainty. And that's where I got really interested in it. And um, even like causal modeling a bit. And Judea Pearl, he introduced us to that type of thing. And that was like really interesting to me. Yeah, and that's kind of how I got into it. At that point, I just loved the fact that you could kind of model this uncertainty. And at that point, like neural nets were just starting to pick up, right? And you
mm,
need a lot of data at that point. So when I chose my topic, there wasn't a lot of data available. So I was like, Bayesian
right.
to fit, right? And we had a lot of domain knowledge we could encode into these models.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Yeah, another friend of mine. He's a Bayesian statistician. He was trying to think of some way to um, what was it? Some alternative to deep learning. He wanted to explore it with Bayes, but I'm not sure how far he got with that. But yeah, it is interesting right now. I think Judea Pearl definitely like did a good job at bringing the Bayesians back into light. But everything's a pendulum. I'm sure they'll see their day again someday. But then you got into data science and you were doing data science, but you weren't doing data science. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, so it's like the typical recovering data scientist thing
Yeah.
to me, right? So, I joined the company all, bright eyed and bushy tailed to be, doing some real production data science. in like a quite a modern, smallish startup that had just grown actually out of startup phase, and then also working with clients. And then it turned out that like most of the problems were not data science related yet, right? Like it's like, oh, but we don't have the data. Oh,
Mm,
but like we need to connect to the service. Oh no, we need like some API layer that can integrate. And how do we handle the OAuth, you know, like, and actually pass all the pen testing and stuff that's required for the bank, and like just getting to have sign off on our architectures was like, half of the battle. So then basically they put me in basically a software engineering team, right, where what I would now call it as like a mix of data engineering and ML ops or ML engineering, but then it was just like, oh, you're the software guys that also know data science.
mm,
Yeah, and I did this basically in different various like forms and for different clients for about 5 years. I did also do a little bit of data science. It wasn't no data science,
right.
but that was a really small part of it. Yeah.
Interesting. So, do you have a preference of what you like better? Do you like the engineering, or do you like the data science more?
Yeah, it's something I struggle with daily.
Oh.
um, no, really, because like there's also a lack of in the team that I'm in. Like one of the data scientists left, so there's like a data science gap, and a new data scientist has joined. So I had actually some opportunity to do some data science,
Mm,
and also we've had some really interesting like problems that fit the Bayesian paradigm. So I don't know if you're familiar with marketing attribution and media mix modeling. Those type of things are actually typically done in a Bayesian way. So also looking at like dynamic Bayesian networks for our forecasting model. So I played around a bit. Even like in my current role, I got some time to do some of the data science, which was really exciting. Again, I was like, oh, this is actually so much fun. But I think I always end up like gravitating towards more like the platform engineering side, where possible, the architecture, kind of looking at the end-to-end system side of things, because I think that's where like unfortunately projects go wrong, right? uh,
mm,
so there's always some like excited data scientists to do the modeling, but there's not always someone that can like talk through the end-to-end system, talk to all the different teams, make sure that we aren't missing some key things that's going to derail the whole project. So I don't know if I enjoy it, but I guess that's what I end up doing.
mm. Yeah, I never heard that story before. Not at all. Um,
You coined the like recovering data scientist phrase.
as far as I know, I was the first person to use that. I mean, maybe somebody else had jokingly used it, but he's the first one to make it public, I guess. So I don't know. Well, back then, I think the term was, I think it's 2015. Somebody's called me a reformed data scientist. I think it's very curmudgeony at an old age, but or young age, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. It is what it is. But now, your story is what you describe is definitely, I think, common.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately or unfortunately, I think it also though meant that a lot more attention was placed on building the foundation, I think, than otherwise would have been um, maybe looked at, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're all doing data science and we're all successful, then I guess you probably don't need all the fancy tooling. It was just that easy,
Yeah.
But I, I don't think in most companies that was a reality, right? I mean, we're
Mhm.
having this discussion for a reason, so um,
Like,
that's interesting. Um, you also mentioned, but you mentioned dynamic Bayesian networks, right?
mhm.
Is that what
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, is that like Stan or what is
Oh, so yeah. So Stan is like one of these probabilistic programming languages. Uh,
yeah.
Use. So, for example, I mean, most people know Stan for profit, right? So, in forecasting, like one of the famous models is profit, and it actually uses Stan under the hood. So, it like uses this package like command Stan and like execute Stan indirectly. It also sets up like a huge amount of like default parameters and things. The standard. I mean, the like profit that we use like as a Python package, right? So, I mean, yeah, if you use profit or if you use kind of like the underlying stand code directly, you can do a lot more. There's a lot more things you can tune and tweak. But yeah, like the dynamic Bayesian network stuff, I was actually using this other really cool Python package. Well, it's a Python wrapper of a C++ package called PyAgram. And
Hmm.
it's actually really, really good for that type of thing. So I've used it for a few, Bayesian models, also for like causal stuff. Yeah, it's really cool, very fast.
Yeah, it's really powerful stuff. When Prophet came out, that's where I learned about Stan. But I was
Ah,
surprised because I was like, oh, you're using. what? That's interesting. Um,
It's in the
because most of the time series stuff was based on a REMA or
Mhm,
some sort of exponential smoothing type model, and not Stan. I was like, that's cool.
mhm.
If it works for Facebook, I guess it is what it is. So it's an interesting approach.
I mean, there's definitely better models out there. I mean, especially because like, you can tune a lot more, you can do a lot more things if you actually like extend and work fully in the Bayesian framework. You can actually add a whole lot more different distributions and things like that. I mean, I
Hmm.
mean, like, yeah, Profit has really like been quite strict, not strict, but they basically set a whole bunch of defaults and constrained the problem to make it easy to implement. But yeah, you can really go a lot further, and I think it's like the research world where you get people really focusing and using Stan. I think most Stan users are like really like, yeah, postdocs or PhD students that are really pushing the boundaries
Mm,
in that sense. But using it in production is mainly probably only done through something like Profit. That's what I've seen.
yeah, same. Yeah, that's interesting. So, one of the things that we were talking about before the show, and it's something that's been on your mind, is navigating larger companies when you're
Hmm.
trying to build machine learning models and other data solutions. Yeah, walk me through that. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, in the roles that I'm in, I'd say roles because it just feels like many different roles. Um,
Right.
the actual data science part is once again a really small part. I mean, it's a really important part. I mean, personalization in general is something that like you can get horribly wrong, and it can be a terrible client experience if the models aren't doing what they should be doing. But I mean, a lot of the problems are actually to do with, the end-to-end integration. Like, I mean, we're creating vouchers, for example, that need to end up in the front end. So it's really like, yeah, touching payment systems, touching stock layer, touching, like coupon generation APIs and all kinds of things like that. And basically, like, that's just a whole lot of conversations with a whole lot of teams. And then you kind of realize, oh, they haven't actually implemented this one piece. Some team hasn't implemented this one piece that like is super critical for your project. And then you have to kind of talk to your product manager or stakeholders up the chain and say, look, you know this thing that we all thought we could do isn't actually possible because this one little piece. And we can get something on the backlog of another team, but it's going to take time. Like, how can we maybe tweak the use cases, and maybe deliver something slightly different and be really agile, to get something out there, right? So yeah, that's where it kind of stemmed from.
Hmm. That's interesting. You mentioned the word agile, and then we're talking about large companies. Are these do these things work well together?
Well, yeah, I mean, I must even say, like, the word agile is so overloaded, right? I mean, I guess, if you think about the whole Scrum agile, I mean, people have many different ways of thinking about agile. I should probably say, like, flexible.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's something that's often not the case in these large companies. But I mean, that's where, like, it becomes almost a skill to build relationships with the right people, and to be able to really be able to communicate, like, what the technical constraints are, and show willingness to come up with alternatives quickly, right? And that's something, yeah, I find like some of the times it actually just means having long extended chats, explaining things and getting to know the people that you work with, maybe not only 100% in just the business context, trying to understand like what drives them, what are they really trying to achieve, bigger picture within the organization as well. And almost like, I mean, I learned part of this in consulting, where people have a problem they're trying to solve and they think this is exactly what the solution is, but often the
Mm,
solution is completely different, or even the problem that they're trying to solve might not be the right problem. So it's really like, I mean, it comes down to almost like understanding the business processes, right? And kind of being able to piece together what happens where an intervention would have the most value, and then maybe go through like all the steps to see how could we get that to work, and if there is data available, um, great. If there isn't, which is like 90% of the time, how can we get the data there and get buy-in from the right stakeholders to help you bring that data there, in the absence of like a perfect data mesh, right?
we'll get there someday. Yeah, that's really interesting. So when you're looking at business processes, you know, these sort of operate on a continuum of different overlapping business processes. Like, how do you,
Mm.
I guess, understand where to start looking and where to stop looking?
Wow. That's a really good question. I mean, it's so true. They like overlap so crazily often. I think, in my personal experience, what we've done is we try to, if at all possible, start as close to the thing that we're working on as possible, and then moving kind of in either direction. I mean, one of the examples is we were looking at risk. So we had all these risk
Mm,
processes for a bank. So you can just imagine, I mean, there's like anti-money laundering processes, there's fraud processes, there's all like, and I mean, for each of these, there's like a whole bunch of different ones that you would do based on like, you know, different regulations and different parts of the client base, based on risk profiles. So there we basically didn't know where to start. We honestly didn't know.
mm,
It was such a confusing story that we actually went and did, like, if you think in the lean Six Sigma world, they call it like a Gemba walk, I guess. So we
yep.
actually had like three of us. There was a business analyst, and then like me and another data scientist, and we basically went and we spent like a whole week sitting with these analysts that basically work. They're the ones that actually do the risk like audits, or they're basically the ones that work with the client data and actually make a decision like, is this like behavior dodgy, or is there some pattern that we've picked up? Is there some sort of Ponzi scheme maybe happening under the scene? They kind of
Mm,
chase the money and do all the stuff, and we spent like hours and hours with them watching how they worked, and then from there basically kind of trying to trace back to where these data sources come from. I mean, a lot of the times it was just like weird stored procs lying somewhere that would like dump something somewhere else, and they would then download it. I mean, there was crazy stuff happening, super Excel based. And we basically had to
mhm,
kind of figure out where the right data sources would have been for all these things, to try and build like automation in, so that they would have to do less, so that there would be less manual work for them to do. And I mean, that project took months, and it was really the business process part that was the key, I guess, to actually try and unravel that.
interesting. I think what you described, the Gemba walk and working with individual contributors, is also a very for some reason people don't do this as often as I would think. It's a very underrated cheat code.
Yeah, I love
I was
that.
actually chatting with a friend about this just a bit ago, 'cause he's asking, okay, so like, who does a data engineer interface? And it was all the technical people. Then it was also, business leaders. And I was like, I think you're missing the most important part, which is the business individual contributors, the people who actually understand what's happening and, um, like,
Mhm.
are involved in the day to day processes. Like you say, these are the people that make it happen, and just go talk to them. It's pretty easy, or maybe it's not. I don't know, but it should be. So
Yeah, I think it's really great, and I mean, they have so much insight. Like we had people that came up with some of the best ideas, right? And it was, I mean, people that actually are the ones doing the analysis themselves, and
yeah.
have never touched anything to do with like a database. They had no clue what an API was. They had no clue about any of those things. But their way they described how they wanted things to be was like, a really cool automation that involved all of these things, but they didn't know how to put that into the right words. So by spending time with them, understanding their language, understanding what they do, we could build that relationship and actually extract that really cool, important information from them, and then build something for them that they couldn't have done on their own and we couldn't have done on our own.
Interesting. So if you would have taken the approach that you described with maybe other people that you've worked with or seen, where they it seemed like they were maybe guessing about what people wanted, and then building to that, was that a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the cases where, I mean, I've also been guilty of that myself, right?
I've done it too. It's fine. We're mind readers.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, we built something for a bank as well. Well, just like a business bank. And well, we did the whole design, and we were literally like, um, I don't know how many sprints in. It was a good few sprints, and we were so excited because we built this whole like master API thing that called different models. I mean, it was really like something that, I mean, I personally was quite proud of. And then we got like information from them. that basically meant the project would stop
Oh.
because we didn't take this one thing into account, and it was like a super businessy thing to do with like they had some commercial agreement with some other provider of some risk score, and they were just going to go with that. And like you know,
Mm,
if we'd kind of asked the right questions earlier on, and understood what this risk score that they were going to get from somewhere would do, then we would have saved ourselves a lot of money. And them also, I mean, they funded some of the work that we did and didn't end up delivering. So, I mean,
mm,
that's the kind of thing that can go wrong. I mean, even in our project now, like it's an interesting team because we've got developers that are like, from a Java background, like super keen on things like Spring Boot, all of these like really cool asynchronous ways of doing things super fast in Java. And then there's like, a data scientist and a half,
okay.
um, you know, and then there's like, no like analysts, for example. So it's basically, quite a lean team in that sense. And then we've got all this like, business ideas and stuff coming from like the project manager and like some of the other stakeholders. And I mean, it's so easy to just jump in and be like, oh, we can build this, and already like on the Java side, the back end side, start to build some things. And then like in a meeting today, we realized like, oh gosh, like some of the data sources are not there. We thought they were there. I mean, I didn't
Mm.
do my homework properly. I just kind of assumed, that everything is in the data lake, and some of it really isn't. Which meant that we actually had to change the use case completely, and even the tech that we were going to use. So
Oh, wow.
it's a recent, mistake. I mean, I guess it's something that happens also when you're new to a company or new to an environment. Like you kind of sometimes make assumptions on the underlying infrastructure or architecture. If you've seen things like patterns a lot, you kind of assume them. But I mean, that's not always the case, and that's something that I've also now recently learned. Don't assume anything.
Oh, you really shouldn't. And it's something I've had to learn the hard way as well, right? Making mistakes of assuming that uh, certain things exist or certain practices are followed, right? And yeah,
Hmm.
you're 1,000% correct. Like you should never assume that because it's there's always you got to go into each project with an open mind because there's always something, um, and it's always like it's usually I wouldn't say always, but it's usually like a really subtle thing that you
Hmm.
didn't pick up on that ends
Hmm.
up being sort of the the linchpin in the entire conversation. So it's but you got to pay attention, right? I mean, it's easy to
Hmm.
overlook this stuff, and because you're always trying to find that most obvious, the biggest things to stare at. And then sometimes those are the distractions. It's sort of like what a magician does, right? Like they keep you focused over
Mm,
here. Meanwhile, the real action's happening where your eyes aren't looking, and that tends to be, at least from what I've seen, if you're trying to do any change management stuff, digital transformation, whatever, it's like it's always the thing you're not looking at that will come
mm.
back to haunt you. So
Yeah, no, that's super true. I mean, and it's crazy that there can be so many people in the room and everyone misses it, right? I mean, that's so often the case. Like it's a whole bunch of smart people, people that have thought about the problem, but then they all kind of miss this like one thing.
yeah, it happens a lot, and I would think it's almost my business partner Matt and I described it as a curse of familiarity. And
Mm,
part of that is if you're so used to looking at something, right, then you're so used to looking at it. I mean, it's no different than the house that you live in or wherever you reside. It's like you're used to how it looks, but
mhm,
in some cases maybe there's like a I don't know some things are misplaced, but you don't. It goes into the woodwork for so long you just don't even notice it, right? Like I'm staring at my kids. I don't know, place or dungeon or whatever you want to call this place. But yeah, it's like I noticed that there's just things where they've thrown them around and it just sits there, right? I mean, we gotta just have to remind them. But that's a lot like businesses in a way, right? You get so used to the way you're doing things and you're so used to staring at the role that's right in front of you, right? I mean, most people don't think about other people's roles when they're at work. They just think about what they need to get done for the day and they get it done and they leave. So the perspective is to step back is the opportunity to step back and look at things from a broader
mhm.
perspective typically is not there.
Yeah,
So
that's super true. I mean, I think something that also comes up that's kind of related to that is when you mentioned roles, it made me think of the fact that people with different roles often come with like really different backgrounds.
yeah.
Um, and like terminology that's used can be completely misunderstood. So, I mean, semantically, there might be totally different meanings to the same kind of like word. Like, I mean, recently, like, we were discussing, pub sub and things like that in different accounts. And we've got a multi
Mm,
cloud environment, which always gets interesting. And talking about things going over the internet. And like, I mean, some people misinterpreted that as like, oh, we're using HTTP, but that wasn't kind of like the correct interpretation of like, no, it's actually leaving the network of this cloud and going over the internet, right? So, I
mm,
mean, this came up like 2 meetings later, like, oh, really, is that happening? Oh, we thought you were just talking about the protocol as opposed to using something else like, a messaging transport. So really interesting small terminology thing. I mean, the common one is always like performance-based metrics, like, you know, um, where you describe like latency potentially, or like, those type of things. So if you measure them differently, you might end up with a
mm.
totally different like value for how much time this little microservice has to respond. Um, yeah.
Well, yeah, and then it comes down to stuff even like process. There's different types of processing times too, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
when the event was created and when it was received, and all these things, right? And it's stuff
Exactly.
that you would take for granted, but again, don't assume anything because
Yep. Yeah,
yeah.
that's so true. I mean, that reminds me of like back in the day in my first job, like my first data analytics task was like based off a bunch of Excel files and using pivot tables. And I remember
Mhm.
being so frustrated. I was like, this is so weird. Why am I doing this? I mean, I came from like a Python background, but I mean, I needed to generate these things in a way that other like people could kind of use them later. And then I just remember being overwhelmed by like 8 different dates. I was just looking through there and I was like, why are there 8 different dates? And how do I know which is the right one and why? And I mean, it was just crazy. I couldn't believe that there were 8 different dates for different events and stuff, and like some also based on like calendar offsets and financial year offsets. And yeah, that was my first like wake up call.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it's interesting too because a lot of these like those dates, for example, right? Those are probably the result of business processes sort of maybe evolving over time.
Hmm.
I'm assuming, but it's not like you started out with an Excel file and it's like, okay, so we're going to get all these dates in here because we're just that smart, right? I mean, the luxury of Excel is you can just keep adding new columns to it.
Hmm.
Um, it's also like that's pretty get in trouble,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's that's interesting. But so walk me through this. So, I mean, you're going through these discussions with all these teams. You're mandated to do machine learning, right? I mean, what's is it just that easy to do machine learning in a large company?
I think, yeah, the challenge is like, really to be able to deliver something of value, to get that first thing out there, right? It doesn't have to be a fancy model. So, I mean, some of our first things are literally going to be like some rule based, inverted commas model, based off like analytical discovery. So, kind of saying, like, okay, if we use these thresholds, what will that look like for the population? And what will the impact be on business, with these volumes, right? So, that's kind of the first thing that's going to go out there, and give us some results. And once you have those results, then you can start to train models, right? So that's kind of I mean, there is some data science also involved, like we're doing segmentation and stuff like that. So, I mean, that's more like the unsupervised stuff. But I mean, doing like the clustering and stuff, I mean, that's like a couple of days work. I mean, that was done up front, for example. Then
Mm,
there's iterating with like the business stakeholder saying, what do these clusters mean to you? Like, how can we convert this into meaningful insights that can be used for marketing and general like user experience and stuff like that. So a lot of the data science is very abstracted also into, like, we're using Spark, for example. So, using Spark ML because it was like easy, right? We didn't need to do anything fancy for some of these things. Um, and the harder part is like, okay, now we have all of this. How are we going to integrate it into like, the full end-to-end business processes? Like, as I mentioned
mm,
earlier, one of the first things we're looking at is like free shipping vouchers. And there's so many ways of kind of going about that. I mean, we wanted to, for example, include margin information, but there, I mean, as people add and remove things from the basket, you don't want to like have them losing vouchers. So there's a lot of kind of behavioral stuff that you also have to take into account. So I guess my answer is that like the actual machine learning algorithms part is often a small part of it.
Yeah.
And because I'm kind of on the more like tech lead end, I end up like passing that on to the data scientists, and they're all too happy to work on those parts, right? But unfortunately, a lot of it is actually end-to-end stuff, and also just like understanding what is possible, like in the front end, and also how all the data is stored. So can it even be used in this way, and that type of thing.
Interesting. How do you work with software teams? Because I'm guessing that, again, assumptions, that the software team, uh, maybe they're very heavy into Java, Spring,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth, right? But maybe they don't understand. Okay, so Rebecca's coming to me with this model. What am I supposed to do with this? Or I mean, do you have any situations like that, or does the software engineering team tend to understand what you're trying to do?
No, for sure. It's been like a really big learning experience. So what they've actually done is they've split up like product teams, and now we actually have 2 Java developers in our team,
Oh,
which has actually really been cool in the sense that like we're all learning a lot from them, and they're definitely learning a lot from us. So I mean, there's like the on the websites front end and back end, they have their own like obviously Java developers, but in our team they've now assign some developers because they want to have like sort of end-to-end delivery as well. And that's been really cool. I mean, the first 2 weeks was rather tough. Like I think I explained like the difference between like training and serving, and
mm,
concepts like batch processing, batch jobs. I mean, they understood some of it, but they didn't have really a data background, so it was really like
right.
developers. So also having to explain like frequencies of different things, like okay, training doesn't happen nearly as much as inference, just like those things that you think that people would know, but obviously they don't if they've never worked with data science, right? So I mean, that was the first couple of meetings. Well, I'd say first sprint was just like getting to get the terminology out of the way, and I mean it still
Mm,
comes up often, like confusion between like the training data and the data that's needed, like the transforms that need to happen like at inference time. And I mean that goes into the whole feature store thing, right? So I mean this has been something that's, I mean, I spoke to you about it like in Munich
yeah,
briefly. It's been a journey and we're still going on along this journey. I mean, multi-cloud, it makes things also complicated, so we're still busy trying to unpack that and understand, like, I mean, it's really a collaboration between like the software teams and the data teams to make this really happen. Yeah, the online part of the feature store at least.
for sure. And I found that that's usually the hard part of productionizing machine learning is you at some point you're going to have to rely on software engineers or the app team to integrate what you're doing into the app. That's how that works. So,
Mm-hmm.
but and they're fantastic usually at what they do, right? But
Yeah.
again, that's one wish I had is I think that there's this. I was talking with somebody last night about this. A friend of mine, she's a software engineer at a company that does a lot with machine learning actually, and she's but she described that divide between software engineering and data as being a very real thing. She's like, oh, the data team sits over there, and I work on the application, and we really don't ever talk to each other. And I was like, isn't that exactly what your product is supposed to do? I think that's really interesting. But she said organizationally, that's how they set it up. The devs don't talk to the
Mm-hmm.
data, and the data doesn't talk to the devs, and so
I mean, it seems so common. Like in the consulting world, I saw that as well a lot. Like, I mean, it's almost like the people came from different worlds, like completely different worlds, and they didn't really understand each other's worlds in a lot of the like a lot of the cases, which makes integration not always so easy. I mean, a lot of the time you get lucky, right? And everyone's like, okay, we're just using Swagger. This is our interface. This is what you get. This is what I get. This is what you give me, and I promise I will give you these error responses, and if things go wrong, or the right answer will look like this, and here's the latency, whatever. I mean, that's how it often does end up happening. But then there's the cases that get really hard where almost on the platform side there needs to be design done, and I find that the harder part.
mm.
if the platforms are set up properly, then it's just some contracts often, right? Hopefully. And I mean, a lot of the times I was lucky enough to work in places where these things were set up quite well in terms of like the platform side of things, right? But I mean, and often in larger organizations, if they're kind of coming from like a more old school background and they weren't initially data driven, then that isn't the case. And then it's a much harder conversation.
What are the prerequisites for a data platform if you're at a mature company?
Well, I mean, obviously there's different ways that it could look, but I mean, this is what I'd love to see, right? I'll probably start there. That I mean, if there's going to be some production layer, so maybe let's take the example of like a e-commerce website, right? You'll have a front end, you'll have a back end, and this back end, will be talking to both, machine learning models at some point in its life, but also, there'll be events generated there, and these events will be pushed somewhere like to some event bridge or something, right? And this will all be streamed into some. Now, this is where the data platform comes in, I guess, like into some data layer, some data lake or something like that. And I mean, the nice thing about having something like that is that if every single event that happens on the front end is captured and sent that way, it really opens up so many more options for your data science. I mean, the other side is obviously like the serving side, right? And I mean, that will live in production somewhere, and the back end of the website in this case would be talking to this layer. And I mean, you could do it like also with like a messaging kind of message transport way of doing things, or with APIs or whatever. But there's kind of not this confusing part that sometimes comes in where there maybe isn't a data lake properly implemented, or yes, there's a data lake, but not all the sources feed into this data lake. I mean, there's obviously the other side as well that I mean I haven't touched on at all, which is like the BI and reporting side where you'll have like a whole warehousing solution, and I mean that's another whole kettle of fish to speak about, right? I mean, even that sometimes like touches even on the concept of a feature store in a way, because what we ended up doing in the absence of a feature store is using the BI, the warehouse for some of our features, and they made for really good features for some of the simple models, right? I mean, those features are literally like so linked to the business metrics.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, it actually worked really well, right?
that's
Um,
cool.
yeah, so I mean the whole that's kind of like the lake house story to a certain extent, right? We've kind of got like the lake and the warehouse, and that's kind of like a nice lake house environment, and there's a continuum sort of how it can be used. But I'd say like the main thing is that to have some sort of data lake that people can access, pull data from freely, so they don't have to worry about like about like pulling down someone's production database. I mean, this does happen too, right? I mean, there's also good designs that use this type of thing where people are allowed to access, maybe source systems for some crazy things. But I mean, typically, if you can just access a data lake and you're not going to pull anything down, and you can pull that into your environment and train your models and do anything like that, and then have a way that you can deploy them and expose them in a like fast and efficient way to the back end that's going to use them.
Hmm. I think it's a good foundation. I like that a lot. Yeah, and again, it's not one size fits all, obviously.
Yeah,
So
no,
I wasn't putting it in a spot like Rebecca.
right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I think but I do see vendors trying to sell like an all-in-one solution and so forth. And I think it's a noble endeavor. Every company's different, as I'm sure everyone's aware of. So it's um, again quirks and stuff. So yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and you got into ML ops too. I would say kind of back when it was first becoming a thing, right? So I mean,
Mm.
that's yeah, what do you think that what do you, I kind of go back and forth on this. Part of me, I'm wondering about the I guess the maturity of ML ops. Like, what does mature ML ops or ML engineering look like to you?
Well, that's also a good question. I mean, I guess there's like some main components that you'd have to see for it to be rather mature. Um,
Yeah,
and I mean, you need to have some way to do experimentation and track those experiments. So, I mean, that's been largely solved by things like MLflow. Like, yeah, there's a few other tools. I've spoken to some other vendors that are doing some interesting things there too. But like, I'd
yeah,
say MLflow is the most commonly, used one.
oh yeah,
Um, So like weights and biases, that type of thing, right? So you can do experimentation, and you can always kind of like go back in time and see, oh, this data was used to train this model, and this is the code that built like the model. Yeah, and these are the hyperparameters or something like that. So you can always like have that traceable experimentation. You can see what metrics are generated or whatever, based on that data, like training, out of time, validation, all that type of thing, right? Then you need a place to store all these models, so some sort of model registry stores all the model metadata. Yeah, so that's kind of on the like the training side. I mean, obviously access to the right data. That's
Yeah,
obviously.
that would help.
And I mean, like, yeah, the whole data versioning thing also, like, I'd say kind of comes into play there. So, I mean, that's where it's still like, for me, something that I'd like to see done better, is kind of like data versioning, not only for like the data engineering parts, but also like for the ML engineering. It's still something that's like something I'd like to see. I don't know. I don't want to go too much into it, but I think that's a part where there's maybe still a lot of like things are done differently by a lot of different companies and different teams. There's not that much standardization 100% on like bringing
Mm.
kind of the data, the modeling, and the code all together. But yeah, so that's the first part. Then a way that you can do like orchestration, I guess, and that's really similar to data engineering in the sense that, I mean, we also want to do, transforming things in terms of features, also like joining different data sources, that type of thing. So that's really similar to kind of the standard data engineering, where you've got something like Prefect or Airflow or Dagster, all of these different things. I mean, yeah, Kubeflow, it's endless, I guess. But yeah, you'll be executing something like that. And then there's like the serving side, which is basically like being able to. Oh, I haven't also mentioned like in the model registry, you might also have like potentially a package management system as well. Maybe not
Mm.
linked to it, but somewhere else, like some sort of JFrog Artifactory. So all your packages for the code get saved there. Laying like the glue of CI/CD that's like ubiquitous, right? Managing all of these things, pushing things to the right places, checking things, running all the unit tests, integration tests. I mean, that's like all part of the whole thing. I mean, also having like a really good like setup of your different like environments where you test things, like especially if you're integrating with other teams and stuff, having like integration environment, super important. So kind of those software engineering principles coming into the ML world. Yeah, then serving, monitoring, I guess also even like the data observability side. And
Mm.
that's also tricky because like compute gets heavy. So you almost want a lot of that to be shifted upstream when you can, to the data sources, to be hoping that they're doing that properly. But I mean, yeah, that's not a solved problem yet. I'm sure. Yeah.
It's not a solved problem. Yeah, and that's a discussion for another day. That's one thing I've been noodling on a lot, more from the data modeling perspective, which and the
Mm,
listeners in this podcast know I just harp on a lot. But well, I mean, if you're using, well, I mean, any data really is created at some point, right?
mm-hmm,
If it's created in a way that I think everyone agrees to it, up and downstream, that's great. That's not reality. So, app developers typically will make data that works for the app because that's what they're paid to do, right?
mm-hmm,
As you point out, the other data quote data use cases aren't typically known, and so
mm-hmm.
I'm not going to fault the app developers. Just they
Yeah.
haven't been incentivized or were wholly ignorant of the need to do that. So again, it
I
is
mean,
what it is.
the crazy thing is even like ML model developers like we can also be kind of guilty of the same thing. I mean, we realize like downstream, I mean, oh, this model that we developed, we're not even saving all the stuff in the right way that we would want later to do our own.
Mm,
I mean, how terrible. I mean, that's just kind of what happens where you kind of make decisions sometimes late at night. um, you know something needs to go into production, there was a hot fix or something like that, and then you're not actually thinking about like the users of that data that you're generating from your model. And I mean, it could be you, like 3 months down the line. So it is a hard thing to do, right?
yeah. Well, and it comes back to that what we were talking about earlier with the those things you don't know about, right? Everyone knows about all the big stuff, but typically, like what you just described, where you're making that decision late at night, not thinking about what it's going to cost you down the road. I mean, those are the things I'm talking about, where it's like somebody made some decision at some point, and this is pretty big consequences on the,
Uh-huh.
how everything else is going to be working, that you've built around that decision. It's like, oh, and the common thing is, oh, well, we'll fix that later, right?
Exactly.
Which usually doesn't happen, but um, so
I mean, this reminds me even of we were building some like data pipeline, and we were at some point writing something also to a data bus, and we used like it was an AWS, and we used like a dead letter queue at some point. So like, oh, if things go wrong, it'll go in the dead letter queue, and then we kind of were like, okay, but we need to process these events later, obviously, right? But we'll deal with that later, I guess. We have like 7 days to deal with it until the events are deleted, and we kind of moved on. So, I mean, that was also one of those like we're going to prod like really soon. At
mm,
least we know the events will be safe, and we've got a week, I guess. We can figure it out then, which is probably a bad decision. But yeah, that's like a real thing that happened.
it's a real thing that happens, and trust me, it happens a lot. So don't don't feel bad about it. It is what it is. Well, that's cool. Kind of switching gears a bit. I think the other thing we're kind of talking about when we're hanging out in Munich is climbing. It's just something I
Hmm.
was surprised. I didn't realize you're into that, but I also climb. So yeah.
Yeah, if I come outside ever, I definitely want to check out some of those cool sites that you showed me some photos of. They look amazing. I mean, honestly, I haven't actually done any outdoor climbing yet in Munich, which is quite sad.
Oh,
I mean, yeah, it's definitely on the cards soon. But in terms of winter, it was like a whole bunch. It's actually mainly bouldering. So I did some like proper climbing in South Africa, especially like 15 years ago. In the university days, we used to go to some really cool places. Like Pole Rock is one. If anyone goes to South Africa, you should totally do it. Yeah, Silver Mine. There's some really cool sites there. So we had a crew that we do some proper climbs there. But yeah, I've just been doing indoor bouldering and trying to get my kids into it. So
oh,
6 year
fun.
old absolutely loving it. And yeah, we'll hopefully do some bouldering outdoor. I mean, don't have any kit or anything for the climbing, the proper climbing, but yeah, for now, bouldering's at least fun.
Yeah, I was actually looking around when I was in Munich at maybe any outdoor spots there. Surprisingly, there aren't that many directly around Munich. But
Mm-hmm.
if you go north or north, I don't know what direction it is, Austria,
Yes.
around Innsbruck, it looks like there's a lot of good outdoor bouldering. So
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah,
really,
I
really
mean,
good.
those places, I think it's basically like an hour and a half to 2 hours, like from Munich.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a lot of cool stuff there. I mean, basically, wherever you kind of hit the Alps and those kind of places, then there
Hmm.
becomes more fun stuff to do. So, yeah, Munich is cool, but like the really cool stuff, even like on the mountain biking side, that's something also on the agenda for us to check out. It's all kind of like an hour or so away.
Oh yeah, and it's lovely, lovely country up there too. So,
Hmm.
but the mountain biking is pretty extraordinary. So, yeah, it's a lot of fun. Yeah, I hope you I hope you enjoy your summer out there. It's one of the yeah, Munich's it's a beautiful city. I really really like it there. And obviously the Alps not that far. It's a pretty cool setup you got. So,
Hmm.
mhm.
Yeah, definitely come make a turn again this side.
Yeah, for sure. Well, awesome. It's been a good chat. For people who want to learn more about you, how can they do that?
They can look me up on LinkedIn. I'm quite active there. Yeah, Rebecca Taylor. I think if you put in ML Ops and Rebecca Taylor, I should pop up. Yeah, that's probably the easiest.
Awesome. Cool. I'll put that in the show notes there. And yeah, awesome. Well, yeah, it's a good chat. I hope the audience enjoyed the chat too. And we'll talk to you soon. Hopefully, see you in Europe again sometime. So
Yeah.
awesome. Okay.